December for us and our family is a particularly busy month because we have Abby's birthday on December 7th, JT's birthday on December 8th, Lexi's birthday on December 23rd, and Sophie's birthday on December 31st. So it's a lot of kind of birthdays. Not to mention Jesus' birthday on December 25th, right? The most important one of them all. And so it's kind of crazy for us at times when you begin to figure these things out. But for me, what has really hit me is, where has time gone? As we're preparing for Abby's 18th birthday. It's like, wait a minute, she was just 2 years old, coming to us terrified. But where did time go? JT's turning 10. And you guys remember when he came into our family, a cute little boy that was terrified. Lexi's going to be 17. I'll have 2 kids graduating in June. Then Lexi will be graduating next year. And then next thing you know, there will just be JT and Connie and I. Life will be boring. Okay, maybe not, but how quickly life goes by. And I was thinking, as I was thinking about that, I was really thinking that that's probably where Solomon is writing this from. He's probably in his mind thinking, God, where did time go? As he's trying to figure out life. Because what I found is, for me anyway, and from the people that I've talked to, is we tend to try to figure out life when we get to that place with like, well, where did it go? Where did all the time go? So what happened? And we try to make sense of things. And so that, I believe, is one of the places that Solomon is coming from. But this week in chapter 7, it's kind of tricky because we get some hope because it's not as depressing as the first 6 chapters. Right? Chapter 7, you're like, okay, I can see light at the end of the tunnel. And what we're going to get from Solomon is some good moral principles, but we got to remember where they're coming from. They're coming from his life when he was living in a backslidden state. He's not necessarily walking with the Lord, and though he's giving us some truth, it's not necessarily some truths that he himself is experiencing. And we need to know that that's a reality in our world, that we can know truth, we can know the truth of God's word, but yet not experience it. And what we need to ask ourselves is, how do we go from that place of knowing the truth in our head to experiencing it in our heart and in our lives? And I pray that that's where we get today. And Solomon is going to conclude, ultimately, that wisdom can't explain all of life's mysteries. And life is full of mysteries. But he does think that it can make life better. And what he's going to do today is going to bring up really 3 ways that life can be better. And so our goal today is to examine these 3 areas with the hopes of answering the question, does God matter in becoming better? Where we can become better. And so the first thing we're going to look at is this. When we look at becoming better, is verses 1 through 10. Can wisdom make life better? The sheer fact, can wisdom, knowing things, make life better? In verse 1, it says, a good name is better than precious ointment, and the day of death than the day of one's birth. Better to go to the house of mourning than to go to the house of feasting, for that is the end of all men. And the living will take it to heart. Sorrow is better than laughter, for by a sad countenance the heart is made better. The heart of the wise is in the house of mourning, but the heart of fools is in the house of mirth. Better seems to be the key word of this chapter. And it's kind of funny because better seems to be the key word in life today. How can I have a better life? How can I be a better me? How can I better myself? How can you become better? And there seems to be the theme that we throw around. Solomon uses it several times, 8, 9, or 10, depending on what translation you're reading. But this word better is repeated in this chapter numerous times. And he starts by saying a good name is better than precious ointment. Now, to understand that, we need to know what precious ointment is. Back in the day when Solomon was writing this precious ointment was the currency for the day. It's what was valued in his time. And so Solomon is saying this, a good name is very valuable. And then he goes on and he says something very fascinating. He says, and the day of death than the day of one's birth. And so Solomon says it's better to go to a funeral than the buffet. I would disagree. So I've come up with my solution to this problem. At my funeral, my casket's going to be the buffet table. You could have both. If I go before you guys, no, hey, it's going to be a good day because we're going to feast. Partly because I'm Portuguese and that's what we do, we eat. And, you know, we're getting there. But here's what he's really saying. The day of one's death or this day of mourning may be the only time that people really consider eternity. And that's what he's looking at. He's looking at what really matters and what's really going to make life better. And that is if we have a proper perspective of eternity. And we need to ask ourselves, when does eternity begin? Many people think it begins when we die. But when we look at eternity, you have eternity past, eternity present, and eternity future. So your eternity began the day that you were born. Now, you're going to go from different places in eternity. You're going to leave this place and be in the presence of God for eternity if you've put your faith in Jesus Christ. And though your location may shift, eternity doesn't. And so how can we live better with the mindset of living eternally today? Matthew 5, 3-4 tells us this. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. So Jesus said that there's actually a blessing in mourning. There's a blessing in being poor in spirit. What is that blessing? That we will be comforted. Comforted by who? By God himself. We don't like to mourn, and God knows that mourning is tough. And because of that, he knows that what we need in those seasons of mourning is his presence to be evident in our life. And Jesus wants to be with us. And what we see is this. People are often more open to Jesus when they're hurting and sorrowful than when things are going great. And that's why Solomon concludes that sorrow is better than laughter, because it ultimately leads to the healing of a heart. Because what we're doing is we're trusting our heart to the healer, to the one who can heal it. The Bible does tell us that laughter is good medicine. That it's a good thing. But sorrow is like the nourishing food that strengthens the inner man. It gives us something that laughter can't. Now, the contrast here isn't birth and death, because Solomon isn't suggesting that it's better just to die. And if you really play it out, you can't really die unless you're born, right? So you can't have one without the other. But what he is contrasting is this: two significant days in people's lives. The first day is the day that you received your name. And the second day is the day that name is written on an obituary. And he's contrasting those 2 days, and he's wanting us to know that how we live between those events really will determine the fragrance that is left behind by your life, how people will think of you and know you. And the truth of the matter is this: we all have 3 different names. We have the names that our parents give us. We have the names that others call us, and hopefully it's the same as the one your parents gave you. But then there's the name that we acquire for ourselves. But 3 names, we each have them. In verses 2 through 4, Solomon encourages us to learn from death. In Psalms 90, verse 12, we're told this: "So teach us to number our days, that we may gain a heart of wisdom." What David is saying is this: realize that your days are numbered and live accordingly. David said this. He said, God, there's just a step between me and death. And that's the truth. And as we live with the reality that any moment could be the last moment that I breathe, we live with this sense of urgency that says, God, I want to be as close to you as possible. I want to experience your fullness and the fullness of your presence in my life today. And I want the fragrance that I leave behind, one that lets people know that you love me and you love them, that you pursue people. In verse 5 it goes on, and Solomon says, it's better to hear the rebuke of the wise than for a man to hear the song of fools. For like the crackling of thorns under a pot, so is laughter of the fool. This also is vanity. And so he's now going to begin to contrast a few things and kind of bring up a few things. And first thing he brings up is rebuke. And what he says is that a rebuke is better than praise. Now, I'll be honest, I don't like being rebuked at the moment. When somebody comes to me and says, hey, I need to talk to you about something, I'm like, okay, what did I do? And I don't like it at the moment. But I will tell you this: if I allow the rebuke to do what it was supposed to do, and if that rebuke is accompanied with love, it brings great fruit. Because though I may not like it, I know that the person that is addressing me out of love for me so that I would be better. And so when Solomon says, a rebuke is better than praise, I believe that that's what he's coming from, that place where we understand that the meaning behind a rebuke, though we don't like it, brings life. But then he compares the songs of fools to burning thorns. Have you ever burned thorns? Ever cut those berry bushes in your yard? Threw them in a vine? It's a lot of noise, but not a whole lot of heat, right? And the songs of fools is just that. It's a lot of noise, but not a whole lot of benefit. And the interesting thing is the word for thorns and pots here, it's the same Hebrew word. And so what Solomon is doing is he's really playing on words describing the emptiness of laughter. It's all the same. Just because you laugh, it's vain. And that's what he said. It's all vanity. In verse 7, he goes on, he says, surely oppression destroys a wise man's reason, and a bribe debases the heart. The end of things is better than its beginnings. The patient in spirit is better than the proud in spirit. Do not hasten in your spirit to be angry, for anger rests in the bosoms of fools. So now Solomon brings up this concept of being patient. And he says the long haul, or the long view of life, is better than any shortcuts. You see, it's easy to take shortcuts. But shortcuts are nothing more than an expensive detour that are often difficult and painful. So Solomon says it's better to be patient and wait. Now, I'm not very patient, especially with this sidewalk project. And anybody who lives on Murphy's Road knows that they should have done this project during COVID when nobody was going anywhere. And then you look at it and you think to yourself, what are they thinking? I do this part here, I leave this section in the middle missing. And then I go and I block the other side of the road and I do this side over here. And then they don't know how to block traffic. And it's frustrating. And it's not hard. Here's what they should do. Put a detour sign up. Don't let people turn right. Ouch. It's a detour. You see what I mean about being patient? But they put a detour. Go to Dogtown, to Gardner Road, and come back. Just let the traffic go this way. But no. I'm not very patient, is what I'm getting at. But he says it's better to be patient and wait. And I can honestly say this, I have really never regretted the times that I've waited. Now, I may not have liked it at the moment, but I've never regretted it because those are the times where I've made the right decisions. But it's the times that I've rushed situations that I ultimately end up regretting. He goes on and he says, bribery appears to be a quick way to get things done. So he's linking impatience with bribery, and which is fascinating to me because you talk to these people in third world countries and everybody asks us, well, why don't we just mail stuff to Uganda, or why don't we just mail stuff to Kenya? And I was talking with Dave and he says, you don't mail stuff to Kenya because by the time it gets there, the people have to pay a bribe to get the stuff, and it's just so much easier just to send them the money to get the stuff that they're paying a bribe for because it's cheaper. It's crazy. Because bribery seems to be a quick way of getting things done, but it leads to frustration. But bribery turns a wise man into a fool, feeding the corruption that's in the human heart. And I've seen this time and time again in third world countries. The people that buy the bribes, it just keeps feeding what they're doing. If you don't bribe people, they're not going to be asking for them. And then I think of our kids. And I know we've all done it. But how well did bribery work for that? Not very well. You know, if you're just quiet, I'll give you a piece of candy. It doesn't really work that well. In verse 10, he goes on, do not say, why were the former days better than these? For you do not inquire wisely concerning this. Now, Solomon is going to talk about the better days of yesterday. And he's reminding us that today really is better than yesterday. And what I found is that when life is difficult, we tend to get impatient. And we look back to the good old days thinking things were way better back then. When you look at when they were rebuilding the foundation of the second temple after the temple was destroyed in Ezra chapter 3, what we see is old men weeping because of the good old days. Things were way better back then, but we can't lose sight that we saw the young men rejoicing because new work began. I'm not saying that the olden days weren't good, but if we have an eternal perspective, we're not going to live there. And what we need to do and what we should be grateful for is the young and the youth in our lives that remind us that God's still working today, that God's still doing something. And then we need to remember that the good old days are nothing more than a combination of a bad memory and a good imagination. That's what they are. So what we should do is we should learn from the past, prepare for the future, but because both are important. And know that worldly wisdom doesn't make life better. And that today we need to live in the will of God, not being paralyzed by yesterday or hypnotized about what is coming tomorrow. I'm not even going to try to pronounce his first name, but his last name is Belloc. He said this, he says, while you are dreaming of the future or regretting the past, the present, which is all you have, slips from you and is gone. So let's live for today. Let's see what God's doing today. He goes on in verses 11 through 18, and he's going to ask this question, can wisdom make us see clearer? In verse 11, wisdom is good with an inheritance, and profitable to those who see the sun. For wisdom is a defense as money is a defense. But the excellence of knowledge is that wisdom gives life to those who have it. Consider the work of God, for who can make straight what has been made crooked? In the days of prosperity be joyful, but in the days of adversity consider, surely God has appointed the one as well as the other, so that man can find out nothing that will come after him. And as he begins to look at making things clearer, he wants to bring in this view of wealth. How do we view wealth? How do we view finances and money? And what he says here is wisdom is better than any inheritance, anything that can be passed on. Why? Because as we know, money can lose value. It could be stolen, it could be lost, it could be misplaced. But wisdom will keep its value. It cannot be lost unless it's abandoned. In verse 14, he goes on and he kind of brings our view and our attention to adversity and prosperity. And he says, wisdom gives us perspective so we aren't discouraged when times are difficult or arrogant when things are going well. And we have to have both of those. We have to be encouraged in difficulties, but humble when things are going well. And we may never understand what God is doing. And we may never know how he makes straight that which is crooked. But we need to hold on to that. We may not know when he is going to make everything beautiful, as he told us in chapter 3, verse 11. But we hold on to the fact that he will. And this includes the things that personally in our life are twisted and ugly. I think of Job, obviously. He's the first guy you come to when you think of a guy that went through trials. I mean, guys, look at your wives and tell them you love them. Right now, come on, do it. Turn to your wife. I love you, right? Because you have someone to love. Because your wife was not Job's wife. Think about that one. One morning, Job wakes up in the middle of this horrible trial, and his wife says, why don't you just curse God and die? Thanks, dear. Oh, I love you too. That's what he's dealing with. But Job had to deal with that. And what he did is he tells her this. He said, why should we just receive good from the hand of God, but not also receive the troubles? Not knowing why he was going through what he was going through, he knew that God would get him through that. And so know that God gives us a balance of blessings that will encourage us, but he also gives us burdens to keep us humble. And this is where Job's friends erred. Because what did they do? They tried to use an old roadmap that said, well, you know, God's showing you favor and you are blessed because of what you have. But when God took Job on a different journey, on a different path, they tried to use that same roadmap, and it didn't work. And the key is this: we need to walk by faith in the good times and in the not so good times. In the day of adversity, we need to be able to rejoice, because Jesus is just as involved in our adversity as he is in our prosperity. And we should never lose sight of that. And so if things are feeling like they're falling apart, maybe Jesus is birthing a whole new understanding for you. Maybe he's got a new journey he wants to take you on. And know this, he's not going to leave you on that path alone. He's going to be there with you every step of the way. Verse 15, he goes on, Solomon says, I have seen everything in my days of vanity. There is a just man who perishes in his righteousness, and there is a wicked man who prolongs life in his wickedness. Do not be overly righteous, nor be overly wise. Why should you destroy yourself? Do not be overly wicked, nor be foolish. Why should you die before your time? And so from this backslidden state, what Solomon says is, don't be too good, or no one will like you, and you'll be isolated. And then he says, well, but then don't be too bad, because if you so, you will die too soon. The Greeks called this the golden mean, which means this: everything in moderation. Don't be too good, don't be too bad, just be somewhere in the middle. Sound familiar? Don't push too much on me. But two facts need to be noted here. Number one, when you look at Israel, we need to note that God promised to bless Israel and their land if they obeyed his law. But he has not given those same promises to believers today under the new covenant. God doesn't promise us blessings. Francis Bacon, who lived between 1561 and 1626, said this: prosperity is the blessing of the Old Testament. Adversity is the blessing of the new. The second thing that we need to note is that the wicked, though they appear to prosper, we only think that if we're taking the short view of things. Take the long view, and you see that that's not the case. And then in verse 18, he says, it is good that you grasp this, and also not remove your hand from the other, for he who fears God will escape them. And so verse 18 reminds us that the way to better our life is to walk in the fear of God and the reverence of God. Proverbs 9:10 says, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and the knowledge of the Holy One is understanding. And the last thing we're going to look at in verses 19 through 29 is, can wisdom make us stronger? Can wisdom be that thing that strengthens us? In verse 19, wisdom strengthens the wise more than 10 rules of the city. For there is not a just man on earth who does good and does not sin. Also, do not take to heart everything people say, lest you hear your servants cursing you. For many times also your own heart has known that even you have cursed others. So what are some of the problems we face in life? Number one, sin. We deal with sin all the time. Why? Because nobody is sinless. Number two is this: people talk about you. That's what he says in verse 20 and 21. Charles Spurgeon had something great to say. He said this, he says, the minister ought to have one blind eye and one deaf ear. You cannot stop people's tongues, and therefore the best thing to do is to stop your own ears and never mind what is spoken. I've realized that an eavesdropper rarely hears anything good. If you're expecting to hear compliments behind your back, you're going to be sorely disappointed. You're not going to hear them. And I'm just going to be honest. I'm 100% certain that people talk about me negatively behind my back. I know that. How do I know this? Because if I'm honest, like Solomon said, I have done my share of talking, to which I have to repent of. And so to you, I will say this: I'm sorry. But we need to examine ourselves and say, God, what am I saying? He goes on in verse 23. All this I have proved by wisdom. I said, I will be wise, but it was far from me. As for that which is far off and exceedingly deep, who can find it out? I applied my heart to know, to search, and to seek out wisdom and the reason of things, to know the wickedness of folly, even of foolishness and madness. And so Solomon's on this pursuit, this hot pursuit of wisdom. He wants to be wise, which is noble. He doesn't want to be a fool, which is a good thing. Like, who wants to be dumb? Not me. No, I don't prove that most of the times. I mean, I look at some of the dumb things I do, and you'd be like, well, what you're saying and what you're doing don't quite match. But I have hope that God is still working. Because this brings up another problem we face, and that is our inability to grasp all that God is doing in this world because we're seeking the wrong thing. We're seeking wisdom and not God to make sense of the deep things in the world. And he goes on in verse 26. Now, I'm going to put out a disclaimer before I read this, ladies. I did not write this. I'm going to repeat that. I did not write this. I have told you that all I'm going to do is teach you the Bible, and then I will talk about things that are in there. I did not write this. I have to tell it to you. Now, remember what we said earlier about talking negatively? Just kidding. But you're going to wonder, you're going to be like, that guy, oh, I didn't write it. You can talk as bad about Solomon as you want to because he wrote it. I'm giving you permission. Okay. I'm going to get down a little bit so I'm safe. Verse 26. And I find more bitter than death the woman whose heart is snares and nets, whose hands are fetters. He who pleases God shall escape from her, but the sinner shall be trapped by her. Here is what I have found, says the preacher, adding one thing to the other to find out the reason, which my soul still seeks, but I cannot find. One man among 1,000 I have found, but a woman among all these I have not found. Truly, this only I have found, that God made man upright, but they sought out many schemes. Please don't shoot me. This was Solomon's conclusion of life. And he compares the battle of the sexes, which is very real. And what you need to understand is the context to which he is speaking this. In Solomon's day, you need to know that women did not have the freedom or the status that they have today. They weren't really thought of in the same category as men. And so as Solomon is writing this, that's the mindset that he has. This is where he's coming from. And this is where I say this. Jesus was the great liberator for women. And we got to remember that. Because it would have been unusual in his time for a woman to have been able to even learn equally to a man. She wouldn't be given the same rights for an education as the man was. And Solomon says this, I found one wise man in 1,000, but not a single woman. Now, what this doesn't mean is that women aren't wise. I think really what it means is men, we're that dumb. If we have the luxury of all the education and he can only find one wise guy in 1,000, really, what does that say about us? We got to hold on to this and examine ourselves. But really what I want to suggest to you is what Solomon is really saying is this, that he really shouldn't have been relating to women the way he was in the first place. To be able to come to this conclusion. He goes on in verse 29, he says, many schemes he found. And we see that. When people aren't valued, they begin to scheme things up to what? Let you know that they are valued. Now, these aren't technological advances. What they're referring to is what is wrong. In other words, God made man right, but man keeps messing things up. And when I say man, I mean mankind, both men and women. Because we live in a fallen state. We are all sinners in need of a Savior. But the truth of the matter is this, is that we should never seek from the opposite sex what only God could provide. And we know that that's what Solomon was doing. I mean, when you have, between your wives and your concubines, 1,000 women in your life, he was seeking in women what he should have been seeking for in God. He was seeking in the opposite sex what only God could provide. His conclusion, there are many snares and temptations in this world, but godly wisdom will overcome them. It's godly wisdom that overcomes them. You see, Solomon says godly wisdom can make our lives better, clearer, and stronger. And we got to seek God first. And we may not fully understand all that God is doing. We may not get why things are happening the way they're happening. But I love that word. JT's loving that word now too, but in a different sense. But I love the passages where you read about these horrible things and then it stops and it says, but God. Because that word but causes us to stop for a moment and not focus on what we don't understand, but who we do know and should know. And though we look at what we don't understand so often, what we need to know is this. We have enough wisdom in our lives for the good of others and the glory of God. We have all that we need to live for the good of others and the glory of God, just by the sheer fact that we've experienced the grace of God and God has saved us. If we're to deal with the sinfulness of humanity, what we need to do is we need to seek God and live our lives in light of eternity for a different kingdom today. Seeking to please Him, realizing that all that we do is actually an act of worship that introduces Jesus to people. We don't need to tap into the strength that the world is offering, because the world has many solutions, and I'm not saying that they're bad solutions and that we can't use those things that the world says is of great value. But what I'm saying is we tap into God for our strength and ask Him to give us wisdom how to use the resources that the world has made available. Because there's some good things. Technology is one of those. Did you know that technology has advanced the spreading of the Word of God probably more than anything else? I have some friends who work with the Wycliffe Bible translators. And what they would do is they'd go into a village and they would learn how, their language and begin to translate the Bible into their language so that they could send them to them. And that process used to take years to get it, to write it all down, and then to get it back out to them. What used to take years is now taking months. The distribution of those same Bibles, because of cell phones, has got the cost way down, and that anybody with a cell phone can now have God's Word in their language. So we don't throw out what God has done in the wisdom of this world, but we need to ask God for the discernment of how to use what He's made available to us for His glory. And we do this as we focus our eyes on Jesus, allowing Him to make us see things clearly, while seeking Jesus, not wisdom, to make our lives better.